Hello again, this is Deacon Bob Pilati of St. Peter Claver Parish in West Hartford. Today we are looking at our fifth installment of the series Christian Peacemaking in the Second Nuclear Age. Today what we want to discuss, or what I will be discussing with you, is the issue of environmental responsibility and the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. We want to look at this not only in terms of its political implications, but clearly its moral, spiritual, and also looking into the futuristic aspects that climate change has proposed. And one particular caveat I want to look at is the security issues that are being confronted by all the world's military about this, because this has a direct bearing on our political and moral reaction to the changes we're going through as a society and as a globe. It's a fascinating discussion in the sense we could start off with thinking about how this is viewed in the United States as compared to the vast majority of the world. It seems that only in the United States is this whole issue of climate change and global warming been so politicized that most poor people really don't understand the issue clearly enough. They hear that things are changing and they don't know what to make of it when we have large segments, including politically significant segments of the nation, in denial about what's going on here. But the Pentagon certainly takes it quite seriously. And one of the books that I would proffer to you as something you could look at in terms of the issue of climate change and security is a book written by Michael Clare. It is called All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Okay, I don't know if that comes out right. He says this toward the end of the book in his conclusion. He says, ultimately, the U.S. military could face an all-hell breaking loose scenario, a situation in which the armed forces are confronted with multiple warming-related crises abroad, while the homeland itself is suffering from severe climate effects, and many of the military's own facilities are immobilized by rising seas or other climate impacts. With governments collapsing in many areas of the world, global trading systems for food, energy, and other vital commodities will begin to break down, producing widespread chaos and flight. In this terrifying scenario, the military will be stretched far beyond its deployable capacity, and senior commanders will be forced to make heart-wrenching decisions about which emergencies can be accorded attention and which will have to be ignored at whatever cost in human life and the national interests. Well, that certainly bespeaks of a rather challenging and harrowing kind of situation. And I think we stated earlier on in the series that global warming and the impact this is going to have on climate has definite security concerns. As states begin to fail, which are teetering as of now, this is going to stimulate mass migration because people are going to look for some level of stability in their life where their children will be fed and where food will be available for them as well. When that begins to dry up, they're going to get on the move. So the issues of immigration that we're seeing today are going to pale in comparison in the next couple decades when we begin to feel the full impact of these climatic situations going on. The Catholic Church, of course, has a particular vision on this, and I wanted to share some of that with you in this session. And then I wanted to look at, kind of wrap up on what the basic viewpoint is in terms overall of the military itself. What are some of our leading military experts saying about this? We certainly know about the political discussion going on. It is clear that some people deny it going on, and others say that it is certainly, the science is certainly very credible, that the vast majority of the world's scientists basically concluding that we are in the midst of this climate change going on, and that unless we take positive steps to mitigate the changes, this could have dire consequences. So I want to go over that. We certainly don't want to play the role of Chicken Little here and say the sky is falling, but we also have to be prudent when it comes to moral evaluations, when it comes to such things, certainly as the environment, which, as we know, this is the only planet we have right now, so we'd better figure this out. In 1971, the Catholic Church held what was known as a World Synod of Bishops. That is, all the world's bishops gathered in Rome and published a document called Justice in the World, probably one of its most famous documents. In this document, they make this statement, that the new technological possibilities are based upon the unity of science on the global and simultaneous character of communications and on the birth of an absolutely interdependent economic world. Moreover, men are beginning to grasp a new and more radical dimension of unity, for they perceive that their resources, as well as the precious treasures of air and water without which there cannot be life, and the small, delicate biosphere of the whole complex of all life on the earth are not infinite, but on the contrary, must be saved and preserved as a unique patrimony belonging to all mankind. I would add all humanity in just terms of getting rid of the sexist statement here. But you really get at what the bishops were beginning to see even in the early 70s, that this interconnection of our environment, of communications, has become more acute now in the year 2020. So what was seen in 1971, we now see it in the light of almost half a century of how deeply interconnected we truly are with the environment and the biosphere. And so we want to look at what is the fundamental trajectory of Catholic thinking when it comes to the environment. I think probably one of the best summary statements on that could be found in Pope Francis' Laudate Si, which was published just a few years back. And he really kind of engages the discussion about the environment, which we'll look at just a little bit later. But if you look at the whole corpus of Catholic teaching through the ages, beginning with the book of Genesis and moving right up through the present time, you'll see certain common themes that run through all of that. When we look at Genesis, in the second creation account, we have in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, you have the human beings placed in the garden, and they are told to care for it and to cultivate it. In other words, they're called to be good stewards, and that stewardship is not simply about the environment, but about each other. They're to be good stewards of each other, to care for each other and to cultivate each other. And so our vision right from the get-go, therefore, is any society or human behavior which does the opposite, which does not care and cultivate for all the members of a society, has forfeited its right to say it's in conformity with the biblical vision. And that biblical vision is not only what God's intention is for us, but it's the most practical kinds of advice we could give anybody. If you don't take care of your house, it's going to fall on top of you. And so that's really what we're talking about. If we don't take care of each other, if we don't take care of the planet we've been given, we can't expect it to take care of us. So let's take a look at some of these. First of all, then, one of the key themes in Catholic teaching is the concept of stewardship. It affirms that human beings, of course, have a unique role in creation. The other animals, of course, the other beings, if you want to put it that way, not only animals, but all the other living creatures also have value. And so we're here to not misuse, but to use what we've been given wisely, to be good stewards, to make sure that we also honor other living beings on this planet as best we can, and to take care of the world we've been given. I think one of the clear signals in the modern age that this is necessary happened in the early 60s. You may remember a woman by the name of Frances Crowe, and I may have mentioned her before. Francis began a group called Women's Strike for Peace in Northampton, Mass., and it kind of spread throughout the country. And this was a response to the atmospheric nuclear testing that the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, and eventually France would be doing. And one of the byproducts of this testing, of course, was the release of radioactive material into the stratosphere of the globe. And this material, of course, known as strontium-90, was falling on the United States and other countries and getting into the grain that was being fed to cattle. Consequently, it was getting into the milk of cattle. And what they were discovering is that this strontium-90 was being found in the bones of teeth of children. And anyone who at that time was consuming any foodstuffs that had been exposed to this radioactive material. Now, strontium-90 has a half-life of about 90 years, which means anyone in my generation has been exposed to this particular radioactive byproduct, some more, some less, depending upon where it fell. But one of the upshots of this is that mothers stopped giving their children regular milk, and we all started drinking this powdered milk, which, if you ever tasted that some over 50 years ago, you realize this was bad tasting stuff. But it began to intimate to us that we are deeply interconnected with the entire planet. And Rachel Carlson's book on Silent Spring that came out right around that same time raised the issue of the effects of DDT on wildlife and how that will impact on the entire food chain. So these were early warning signs that we needed to look at our role in creation as human beings, and that as being created in God's image and likeness, one was to live that way, which meant to take care of what you've been given, to be good stewards, and to reflect the love of God for all peoples in this world, regardless of race, color, creed, socioeconomic status. You know the whole 9 yards here. We have yet to do that as a human race, and we're trying to get there. But as we know, whenever we try to make major, or what we would call seismic changes in our world, there's always a pushback from those who wish to maintain the status quo, either because of their fear or they benefit from the present situation, which may be filled, of course, with injustice and cruelty. But nevertheless, we need to move forward on this, and this is part of the Catholic vision of things. Pope John Paul II, who was canonized a saint, in 1990 wrote The Ecological Crisis, A Common Responsibility. And in it he makes this statement: "The profound sense that the earth is suffering is also shared by those who do not profess our faith in God. Indeed, the increasing devastation of the world of nature is apparent to all. It results from the behavior of people who show callous disregard for the hidden yet perceivable requirements of the order and harmony which governs nature itself." That was article number 5 in that document. And so we have not only obviously Pope Francis, but many of the popes going back really to Paul VI, and then succeeding, we have John Paul, we have, Cardinal Ratzinger. At the time it was Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, and then we also have Pope Francis. So this is sort of a modern theme of Catholic social teaching that is being addressed in a more pointed way because of the major challenges we're facing at this point. The other thing is Catholic teaching, which would be typically Catholic, and it points to the aesthetic value of creation, that its beauty and its charm and order direct us to God's mediated immediacy through creation itself. Often there are times when people are simply roused by a great sunset or a beautiful landscape that kind of connects them with the divine life, okay? All human beings are co-creators with the Lord in helping to build up creation as an anticipatory sign of the transformation of creation that is promised in the resurrection of Jesus. So the recognition is we're working with God and others to not simply live in the world, but to help craft the future world where there is true justice and peace and the recognition of the dignity of all people that must be reflected in the way we treat our environment. Being co-creator means we have an active role to play. So as people of faith, we're not called simply to believe stuff, obviously, but to take up our role, our mission in the world, proclaiming the gospel, building community, and rendering service in being charitable and working for justice. Christianity without that understanding becomes just a mere ideology and some kind of what we'd call Gnosticism, that is secret or special knowledge. But if it doesn't affect the life course and decisions we make, it's not really faith. It's just another idea. Okay, responsible human activity with creation is a recognition that we live in an interdependent system and world. We got that earlier. Catholic teaching, of course, is God-centered. It is about our relationship with God. It's not just, so therefore it's not optional. It's not, well, if I want to do it, I'll do it. I'm not really into that kind of thing. That's not it. I mean, it's not like I have a choice, especially after baptism. But once I was ordained as a deacon, I assumed that this was my role. I had to. Otherwise, what's the point of my ordination? It would be the same for priests and bishops. If they are not working in this regard, then what are they really doing? Is a big question posed by the papal encyclicals that had come down for over the last 100 years. Stress is placed on the ethics of solidarity among human beings and with the other creatures. That's important. There is an emphasis, obviously, on the preferential option for the poor, meaning not the exclusive option, but the preferential option, because so often it is poor people who live in the areas that are most affected by the degradation of environmental landscapes and so forth. Often people who are the most poorest live in the most environmentally damaged areas, and of course that contributes to poverty, but it also contributes obviously to ill health. That combined with a call to environmental responsibility is a call to environmental justice. So that's a follow-on to that last point, that we have an obligation to environmental responsibility so the poor and the needy don't suffer more than they are already suffering, and in fact to work with the poor and to work with the wealthy and powerful to change the situation. Okay. The Catholic Church basically asserts that the goods of the earth belong to all people and must be distributed in such a way that all people can realize their human potential. We've got a long way to go with that. Obviously, in the world, we still have great poverty and a growing disparity between the haves and have-nots in terms of income. That is a volatile and dangerous situation which, not addressed in the next couple decades, could lead to a global conflict with weapons of the nature of which we don't want to see have a conflict. Weapons of mass destruction being used out of frustration or accident, miscalculation, revenge, where people are so desperate that they are willing to do anything to kind of resolve deep injustice. We simply cannot afford that scenario to develop. So it's in our interest to make sure that the goods of the earth are distributed appropriately. It doesn't mean everyone gets the same stuff, but it does mean that people there is a baseline which they must have for sustaining human life, but also for flourishing as human beings. That is the Catholic vision. To do otherwise is to invite disaster. It may not happen tomorrow, but sooner or later, if things aren't dealt with, we're going to have a much more conflictual world on our hands. Catholic teaching also emphasizes a way that calls for not only the conversion of the heart, but the conversion of our social structures. Conversion of the heart without conversion of the way we've structured our society is a half measure at best. It's an incomplete manifestation of faith at the best. At the worst, it is a tactical or strategic move not to change the status quo because someone is benefiting from it while others are losing. That is not in the Christian spirit. It certainly is not in the spirit of Jesus, who ultimately is our master, not some political party or political figure or economic system or whatever. I am fascinated by the almost, if not religious, certainly the die-hard view that only one economic system is morally and spiritually what we should be doing, when in fact sometimes those systems are destructive of our moral and spiritual lives. No one can claim that the materialism of our age is a good thing spiritually for us. I think most people live or try to live modestly, or at least appropriately. Most people have a pretty decent balance between the material and the spiritual, which can be actually quite closely linked. But some go way out of hand, and greed and avarice can be the byproduct where millions of people will suffer because of it. We know that to be certain. The other thing is, in the Christian tradition, of course, the triune God raises the issue about how we respond to the world around us. You remember, all members of the Trinity, of course, respond to each other in what we would call kenotic love. That is, the outpouring of sacrificial love for one another. And that is what certainly Christians are called to, but that's really the human quest as well. If you look at all the great religious traditions around the world, this is the key, this pouring out of our egotism in terms of the embrace of the other, the love of the other, compassion for the other. If these things are absent, or if we have political people who are trying to tell us the opposite and to divide people into race and class and to turn people against each other, then that's not a horse we want to saddle. That is something we need to simply say no to. And in fact, we're required to do so. It is distressing in the time we're living right now how many people who you know are decent have remained silent or have been complicit in carrying out divisiveness, not only within our own nation, but around the world. This simply is unacceptable, and it is sin. It is sin in the biblical sense of what separates us. Anyone who attempts to separate others by using fear or anger or resentment or whatever is the motive, this in fact is sinful behavior. And it would behoove many people who call themselves Christians to kind of remember that. There's a couple things I think that are important. I think we should kind of look at some definitions. And that is environmental equity, environmental justice, environmental racism, and environmental classism. These are terms used by modern social thinkers as to deal with some of the problems that arise from the environment in the way people are treated. So environmental equity is an ideal of equal treatment and protection for various racial, ethnic groups, and so on and so forth, where everybody is treated fairly and has access to the things they need to live, and where they live in an environmentally sound and safe area. Environmental justice is the right to be safe, healthy, productive, and have a sustainable environment for all people. Environmental racism is racial discrimination. It can be shown in environmental policy making and enforcement of regulation and laws, and targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and the sightings of polluting industry. This has, of course, been sort of the typical trend of history. People who have very little political power, or very little difficulty have much difficulty rather, standing in the way of people who want to dump their chemicals on their land. Okay? Environmental classism, the results of and the process by which the implementation of environmental policy creates intended or unintended consequences which have disproportionate impacts on lower income people, populations, and communities. So you can see it happens in race, but also in class. I think these things are helpful for us to know this because it helps us to kind of expand our knowledge of the basic environmental concerns that we have as the Catholic Church and their relationship to justice, which of course is a critical aspect of this entire discussion. So the Catholic Church has more or less come to a series of principles. There are these major principles. There are 7 of them that the U.S. Catholic bishops have made known in their environmental responsibility program. And I'd like to kind of go over this. Number 1, the first principle is that we live in a sacramental universe. That is, we are embodied creatures, and so all the things we believe, all that our loves, our hates, whatever, is always manifested through our bodily existence. Therefore, it means that if we're going to live the gospel vision, it needs to be manifested through our bodily existence and how we treat the world and one another. We also know, of course, that God is present through the created reality. God is certainly immediately present, but mediated through the creation. So what we really, our relationship with God is greatly affected by how we treat others and the creation. That's really kind of the way we grow spiritually one way, or we retard in our spiritual development. Respect life and creation. That life is a gift. No scientist can tell you where life and how it began, and why it replicates itself and why it develops really into such things as Elvis Presley and so forth. This is one of the great mysteries. We can talk about the process of evolution and so forth, but it never gets underneath that process as scientific explanation, and probably can't, because it's something which transcends our capacity to quantify and to put in a test tube. But this respect for life and creation are an essential principle. Third principle, global interdependence and the common good. These are essentials. We know too often in the United States especially, we are hung up on our individual rights. And individual rights, of course, are very important. It helps to prevent the assertion of tyranny. However, there's also the call to responsibility, and that means looking after the common good. Without this, society becomes distorted. People are self-aggrandizing. They tend to cut off from others and their concerns. They become less empathetic. I suspect that that is one of the reasons why we're going through some of the political challenges and social challenges that we are facing today in the United States. Solidarity and cooperation are the fourth. Solidarity basically says all human beings and all creation are ultimately interdependent with each other. Now, we see this now on a very physical plane in the world, but it has always been the spiritual truth that I am my brother or sister's keeper, because we're all connected. It is the fool who simply believes that I can do anything with impunity, that for eternity, what I do against others has no consequence. Well, in fact, it does. And this has been what all the great religious traditions say. In a sense, there's no free lunch. We cannot harm others without some kind of spiritual consequence. And of course, when we love others, there's a spiritual benefit. We grow into who we really are, which is, at least in the Catholic sense, and in most of the great religious traditions, to somehow manifest God's love in the world. That if we do that, we begin to really come to a sense of who we really are. And so what sin is really kind of a denial of who we are. When we sow violence and hatred and enmity, we sin not only against others, but ourselves as well. Fifth, the universal right to the goods of the earth, which we stated earlier, to have a sustainable and meaningful human life. A preferential option for the poor in working for environmental justice, and stewardship for the earth and others. These are the major points of Catholic teaching. And in the light of the present situation, we can see how relevant they are. Of course, there's been some discussion whether or not global change is a reality. Let me just quote you a couple people. One is General Gordon R. Sullivan, who's a former chief of staff, U.S. Army National Security and Climate Change Study in 2007, he reports that people are saying that they want to be convinced perfectly. They want to know the climate science projections with 100% certainty. Well, we know a great deal, and even with that, there is still a level of uncertainty. But the trend line is very clear. We never have it. If you wait until you have 100% certainty, something bad is going to happen on the battlefield. That's something we know. You have to act with incomplete information. You have to act based on the trend line. The situation for much of the Cold War, he said, was stable, and the challenge was to keep it stable, to stop the catastrophic event from happening. We spent billions on the strategy. Climate change is exactly the opposite. We have a catastrophic event appears to be inevitable. And the challenge is to stabilize things, to stabilize carbon in the atmosphere. Back then, the challenge was to stop a particular action during the Cold War. Now the challenge is to inspire a particular action. We have to act if we're going to avoid the worst effects. And then General Anthony D.C. Zinni of the Marine Corps, former Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command, writes this: "You already have great tensions over water in this world. These are cultures often built around a single source of water. So any stresses on the rivers and aquifers can be a source of conflict. If you consider land loss, the Nile Delta region is the most fertile ground in Egypt. Any losses there could cause a real problem again because the region is so fragile. We will pay for this one way or the other. We will pay to reduce greenhouse gas emissions today, and we'll have to take an economic hit of some kind. Or we will pay the price later in military terms, and that will involve human lives. There will be a human toll. There is no way out of this that doesn't have real costs attached to it." So I believe that certainly this raises some serious issues. In 2007, the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Center for a New American Security published a report entitled "The Age of Consequences: The Foreign Policy and National Security Implications of Global Climate Change." And they write this: "Although the consequences of global climate change may seem to be the stuff of Hollywood, some imagined dystopian future, the melting ice of the Arctic, the spreading deserts of Africa, the swamping of low-lying lands are all too real. We already live in an age of consequences, one that will increasingly be defined by the intersection of climate change and the security of nations." And lastly, I wanted to conclude with a citation from Laudate Si by Pope Francis that will wrap up this particular session. He writes this: "Climate change is a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. Many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by the phenomena related to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystem services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. For example, changes in climate, which will affect animals and plants that cannot adapt, lead them to migrate. This in turn affects the livelihood of the poor, who are then forced to leave their homes, with great uncertainty for their future and that of their children. There has been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They are not recognized by international conventions as refugees. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever. Sadly, there is widespread indifference to such suffering, which is even now taking place throughout our world. Our lack of response to these tragedies involving our brothers and sisters points to the loss of that sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all civil society is founded. That is Article 25. An extraordinary message of the Pope, and one I think that we need to take deeply into account. I'm reminded of the book by Gwynne Dyer called Climate Wars, The Fight for Survival as the World Overheats. He was raising these very issues that the Pope raises. And he puts this, he said, by the year 2045, the planet's average temperature will already be 2 or 3 degrees Celsius hotter and heading for 8, 9, or 10 degrees hotter by the century's end. In this world, our worries are not just hotter summers, bigger hurricanes, rising sea levels, and polar bears swimming for their lives. We are trying to avoid megadeaths from mass starvation and quite possibly from nuclear wars. And the odds aren't that good. They're not that good unless we assume our responsibility as Catholics, Christians, and as human beings. So let us pray together. We will end with prayer. Father, we praise you. With all your creatures, they came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light you guide this world toward the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth. O Lord, help us to help the poor and the earth who are crying out. Seize us with your power and light, and help us to protect all life and to prepare for that better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. Thank you. I will see you in the next session.